Betsy Ross, she deserved the truth, and America gave her a fairy tale instead. So all us Americans hear the flag story that you were taught in 2nd grade, like the one with the construction paper and the glue stick and George Washington showing up at her door like he's got nothing better to do. That's really not true, and it was actually never supposed to be. A grandson made it up 34 years after she died, and America believed it because we needed a war hero who could sew instead of shoot. But the real Betsy Ross didn't need Washington to show up. She was already running a business, burying husbands and outworking half the people on her street. And somehow that version got left on the cutting room floor. Hi friends, I'm Betty Rage, your favorite nerdy goth mom, and this hot mess here is Lashes and Lore, where I used to put on my makeup and tell you a story, but now I take thrifted, unraveled sweaters and I make granny squares to one day create the most exquisite Franken blanket. These are our previous squares here that you've ever seen. Our Blankenstein, our Franken blanket. We've been calling it a couple of different things here and over on Patreon. And honestly, this square right here that we're putting together was a couple of old sweaters. I decided to do the blue and white alpaca wool mix with this cotton red because we're talking about Betsy Ross today. Happy 4th of July. If you're watching this on the 4th of July, and if you care about America, please don't give up on us. And this week, my shop, Reanimate Threads, opened up, so I am pretty excited about that, where I do more of this. I take thrifted things, unravel them, and remake new things out of them. And I'm a D&D nerd, so reanimate threads instead of the spell reanimate dead. Well, necromancy never hurt anybody, right? We have our energy drink. Thanks to all you cuties out there who've been supporting me one energy drink at a time. Occasionally I get genuinely unreasonable about how we hand people a nicer, better, cleaner, more fairy tale story than what actually happened in the history of their life. And today, Betsy Ross is absolutely proof of that. Let me explain. So let's actually meet Miss Betsy Ross, because nobody actually bothered to do that before they turned into a founding father action figure with a sewing kit. So let's do it right this time. Elizabeth Griscom, Betsy, grew up Quaker, one of 17 kids, which honestly explains a lot about her work ethic because you do not survive that household without learning how to get things done. And even before the war, before any of it, she was already the kind of woman who did not do what she was told. At 21, she fell in love with a man named John Ross, an Episcopalian, which her Quaker family and her Quaker church considered that's a deal breaker. So she eloped, married him at a tavern, and got disowned for it, kicked out of her family, kicked out of her congregation. The entire community that she grew up in was just gone. Sure, it's maybe not that important that she found love outside of her religion and eloped to be with him and rejected everyone in her family and congregation in order to do so, but maybe it is, because I feel like that would kind of define a person. So Betsy Ross's first act as an adult was choosing herself over everyone else telling her, no, don't do that. So she and John opened an upholstery shop together and joined Christ Church, which is actually a detail that is worth knowing because their family pew sat really close to George Washington's. So they genuinely crossed paths with George Washington for years before any flag existed. Probably the one true thread that the whole legend eventually got stitched into. Then in January of 1776, John was guarding a stash of gunpowder in Philadelphia on the waterfront, and it exploded. So Betsy was 24 and now a widow, running a business alone in a city about to become a war zone. And what did she do with that? Well, she kept the shop open and she kept stitching. And I do mean that literally, because the sewing machine did not exist yet. Not really, not for decades. Every single seam, every stripe, every single star on every flag that she made came out of her own two hands. And while I love crochet, love it, I literally do it every single day for hours, right? Hand sewing with a needle is a very tedious, hard pass from me. So, big time respect to her for that. She took government contracts nobody's grandson bothered to invent a story about. Real, boring, paper trail contracts. Making ship's colors for the Pennsylvania Navy in 1777, getting paid 14 pounds and change for it, because that's what actual survival looked like at the time. Not a visit from George Washington, an invoice, and a whole lot of hand cramps. And even the little detail, everyone loves the 5-pointed star, the single snip of scissors, that's part of the legend too, not the record. It's a nice story. It's just not a documented one. She did go on to marry twice more and bury another husband. Keep working through all of it, and somehow the version of her that got remembered is the one where a man shows up and gives her the idea. So, yikes. So if none of the truth made it into the story, what actually did? Well, in 1870, a man named William Canby stood up in front of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and told everyone that his grandmother made the first American flag. One problem. Canby was actually somewhere between 6 years old and 11 years old the last time he actually saw her alive, depending on who you ask and what source you're looking at. She died in 1836. He's telling this story 34 years later based on family lore that he says she told him as a child. And there is no paperwork, no letter, no receipt, no single piece of evidence, no secret committee, no George Washington sketch, and no visit at all. And it's not that Canby was necessarily telling a lie. It's that he was telling a story at exactly the moment that America was starving for one. The country just clawed its way out of a civil war that tore families apart over who counted as an American and who didn't. The centennial was coming up in 1876. Philadelphia is about to host the whole nation for a birthday party. What America wanted wasn't a woman who got disowned by her family, buried two husbands, and hand-stitched flags out of financial necessity. What America wanted was a nice, tidy legend where the founding father himself handpicks a humble seamstress and she says yes and gets to work. The myth even built itself a house. There's a home on Arch Street in Philadelphia that tourists line up for every year, the actual Betsy Ross house, except historians still argue about whether she ever actually lived there, which feels kind of weird. Is anything real? Is anything true? I'm beginning to think no. Legend needed a physical place to have happened, so it got one, whether or not record backs it up or not. So that is the version that got framed on classroom walls. Not the one where she said no to her entire community at 21. The one where she said yes to George Washington. But what's kind of funny, in like a annoyingly disturbing kind of way, is the version that they picked isn't even the interesting one, because the woman who actually existed did something way harder than sew a flag on request. Before I tell you exactly what Betsy Ross did, here is a quick pause because I want to talk about something else that is built to last, like the flag. This is a Reanimate Threads plug, and I am not sorry about it. Right now through September 1st, it is Summerween, because we love summer and we love Halloween. Although we love Halloween more, don't tell Summer. Sorry, girl. I am having a Summerween sale on Reanimate Threads. $5 off any order of $30 or more with the code SAVE5ON30. Everything is still handmade, still sustainable, still made from yarn that had a whole life before it got to me, and now it has a new one. Kind of like today's episode subject. The link is in the description. The code is SAVE5ON30, so go treat yourself to a little Summerween treat. It is hot as Hades out there, so maybe go get yourself a little can cozy with a handle because we're all a little clumsy around here. And it'll keep your hands from getting wet and cold and clammy and disgusting, but also help keep your drink cold. Back to Betsy. There's actually a real contender for who actually designed the flag. And it's not Betsy Ross. It's a man named Francis Hopkinson, congressman, lawyer, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and by most accounts, kind of a Renaissance man and show-off. In 1780, Hopkinson actually billed Congress for designing the flag. But not only the flag, the Great Seal, and a handful of other government symbols. And he wanted to be paid in a quarter cask of wine, because apparently that is what the Founding Fathers considered fair compensation. Congress never told him he was wrong. They just refused to pay him on the grounds that he already had a government salary and wasn't the only person that they'd consulted. And that's it. That's the whole controversy. A man with an actual paper trail and an actual bill and an actual documented claim got stiffed on wine money and mostly forgotten, while a woman with no paper trail at all got a house, a stamp, and a national legend. Make of that as you will. All right, but so why does the real story matter? So let's go back to Betsy, the real Betsy, not the legend Betsy. She rebuilt her life, her whole life, from scratch 3 separate times. Every time one of her husbands died, she didn't get a break. She got a bill. She had a business to run, and later a house full of daughters to feed. The winter of 1777, when British soldiers occupied Philadelphia and forced their way into her actual home. They lived there in her house, and Betsy was so openly, stubbornly patriotic about it that the soldiers occupying her home gave her a nickname. She was the Little Rebel. And nobody handed her a sketch and asked nicely. She had enemy soldiers sleeping under her roof, and she kept showing up decade after decade because that is what the actual job required. And that's the thing about real resilience. It doesn't come with a committee of founding fathers standing in your parlor telling you that you are important. It looks like paperwork and an invoice for 14 pounds. It looks like a nickname given to you by the enemy because you wouldn't stop being yourself in your own house. We didn't need to invent a better story for Betsy Ross. We just needed to actually believe the one that she was already living. All right, so what's the mom moment? Because I'm not going to let this one go. Here's my little bit of insight that is purely my own opinion. We do this constantly, not just to Betsy Ross, to a whole lot of history. We take someone who did something genuinely hard, and instead of sitting with how hard it actually was, we hand them a fairy tale, because a fairy tale is easier to love. A famous person shows up, picks them, and suddenly they get to be special because of that. But a widow who kept a business alive through a war, through soldiers in her own house, because the alternative was letting her family starve, that doesn't need a rescue. That doesn't need a sketch from George Washington to make it worth telling. That was already enough, in my opinion. So if you are out there and you are doing the unglamorous version of hard right now, the invoice version, the 14 pounds invoice version, not the blockbuster movie version, I need you to know that that's really not the story that people should be simplifying. That's the one that we should be telling exactly as it happened. And in my opinion, Betsy Ross deserved better than that fairy tale story. So if you're only aware of the version where George Washington showed up and gave Betsy a secret mission to create a flag for the United States, it's a cool story, but the one that actually happened was actually better, in my opinion. And here is our very patriotic blanket square for this episode. It's all right. So make sure that you drop Betsy down in the comments and tell me who else got the fairy tale treatment instead of the truth. And maybe I'll do a video on that. Next, I want a list. It's time for me to update our little Patreon post with all of the squares that we currently have completed from all of our stories. I love the idea that all of these squares are infused with the stories that I'm telling here with all of you. This is going to be pretty special when it's done one day, just like Frankenstein's monster. And if you are in the US, happy Independence Day. Remember that the story that you're telling right now is the most important one, not some fairy tale that maybe is making it into the news. And now that we finished the story about the American flag, I do have a story here about how the Welsh flag came to be, and it's a very interesting one. I'm Betty Rage, this is Faye, and this was Lashes and More. Be good to each other, love each other, and as always, free mom hugs. Woo! From me to you. See you in the next one.
So tired. You're a hot girl.
All right.